started. It's wonderful to see so many people on the call. Thank you all for being with us. Just as a reminder, we are recording this so we can share this with members of our community who couldn't be with us today. So I will turn it over now to Dr. Crystal Strong to introduce our esteemed guest.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to see so many of you here. It is truly a pleasure and an honor to introduce Dr. Sally Nuamah, who I know many of you are already quite familiar with, but I would love to read her biography, which is incredibly accomplished, just so that we're all aware of who we have the honor of learning from today. Dr. Nuamah's research sits at the intersection of race, gender, education policy, and political behavior. She completed her PhD in political science at Northwestern University in June 2016, where she is also currently an assistant professor in the Urban Politics and Human Development and Social Policy Department. Previously, Dr. Nuamah was an assistant professor at Duke University and a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University, a Women in Public Policy fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, and also a pre-doctoral fellow here at the University of Pennsylvania. Her first book, How Girls Achieve, was released by Harvard University Press in April 2019, and it is a wonderful book that I hope many of you have already read. And it has received a number of awards, in addition to the awards that Dr. Nuamah herself has been awarded with, including Forbes Magazine's 2019 30 Under 30 in Education Award, and as well a 2019 Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, which is also called the Brainy Award. So with that, I hope you will join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Nuamah today for our Visiting Scholars of Color program.
Thanks so much for that awesome introduction. Pressure, but we're gonna work it out. Okay, let me share my screen. All right, so I am really excited to share with you all virtually this new research. It really feels kind of like full circle for me. As Crystal mentioned, I was a pre-doctoral fellow at Penn when I was a graduate student. And it was during this time that I found GSE to be kind of a second intellectual home for me. So being able to come back and present this new work is exciting. It's also during that time that I conceived of this project. So right before coming to Penn, I worked at a halfway house in Chicago with women who were recently released from prison. And I noticed one by one, them detail stories about experiences they had with the justice system in their youth that seemed to have these important social and political consequences later. So I always knew I wanted to do a project such as this. And through the support of the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, I've been able to do that. And so I'm going to present to you a project that's interested in how the punishment experiences of Black women and girls really affect our democracy. I have a lot to share. Again, this is new research, so I'm really looking forward to the Q&A and to being able to really have discussions about the various things that come up today. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. I want to start by highlighting a story that got a lot of attention in the news earlier this year. It was revealed that a Black girl who was 15 years old and went by the name of Grace was essentially arrested and detained for not completing her online schoolwork. Now, this is in the middle of a global pandemic when 25% of the nation's school children either hadn't done their online homework or had logged online, period, since the pandemic began. And yet it seemed a bit unusual that Grace was sort of the only person that was arrested and detained for this. Now, for those of us who study Black girls, we know that this pattern is not at all new or novel, but that in fact, from slave codes to Nixon's war on drugs, the racial violence and incarceration of Black girls have been a central and consistent theme of American democracy. It's important to note that the first girl lynched in America was Black. It was 1786, and she was 12 years old. Over 100 years later, Black girls will go on to be 19 times more likely to be arrested than their white female counterparts. Today, these disparities persist. This picture is of a 6-year-old Black girl who earlier this year, it was revealed was arrested, taken a mugshot, and for essentially throwing a temper tantrum. Again, this news story may be perceived as novel, but it is not. Starting as early as preschool, Black girls represent 23% of the public school population, but close to 50% of those preschoolers suspended. This persists as they enter primary school, and Black girls are 6 times more likely to get suspended compared with white girls. This persists as they enter middle and high school, and those suspensions translate to arrest, as Black girls represent 16% of the population, yet they represent 44% of those arrested. Once they're arrested, they have a higher probability of ending up incarcerated. So Black girls are nearly 4 times more likely than white girls to be incarcerated. And as adults, Black women are imprisoned at twice the rate of white women. So we can see very clearly the ways in which school to confinement pathways played a really significant role in Black girls' lives. Despite these jarring statistics, we still know very little about the public perception shaping the punishment of Black girls and its potential political consequences. As a political scientist who also studies political behavior, it is surprising how little we know about the ways in which punishment impacts the ways that Black women and girls engage in our democracy. And so this research has a lot of different questions, but I'm going to talk about the questions that the data I will show you will specifically provide evidence of or in support for, and that is the following questions. What are the public perceptions of Black women and girls? How do race and gender affect support for the punishment of Black women and girls, or specifically Black girls who are in the K-12 level? And then how punitive experiences shape the political participation of Black women. It's important to note that I am especially interested in Black women's conceptions of citizenship, of democracy, of their role as citizens compared to others, right? Those broader visions for themselves. And I'm going to present some qualitative data a little later that sheds light on some of that. In political science, much of the work on race and criminal justice and politics has involved Black men. From this work, we know that most Americans support Black men's incarceration, particularly if they perceive the justice system as fair. So if you see the justice system as a place that's doing equitable work, then you actually think that their incarceration is justified. However, studies on the public perceptions of the punishment of Black women and girls are rare in political science. I can talk about the exception to this case in Q&A if people are interested. The work that we do know on this topic largely exists in education, and it suggests that dominant group perceptions of Black women and girls' behavior, so being too talkative, loud, mature, are inconsistent with traditional feminine norms, and that this is what explains these disparities. And so I know you guys are going to have Monique Morris here later, and it's really kind of, taking from that argument. This perception of Black girls taking on behaviors that defy norms, specifically around gender, has culminated into sort of the theory of adultification that I'm sure many of you all are aware of, that essentially represents the process by which Black girls are viewed as more adult-like and thus less innocent relative to white girls of the same age. And so the idea here, right, is that because Black girls are viewed as older and more mature in defying these traditional gender norms, that this might actually impact the way that they are punished. But there's not a lot of research on that direct relationship. One of the existing studies on this topic is heavily cited and was recently in the New York Times, and it basically reveals that white respondents view Black girls as adults as early as the age of 5, suggesting that adultification may explain the punitive experiences of Black girls. It's important to note here that 5 years old for Black girls is 5 years younger than when Black boys start to be viewed as adults. It's also important to note that while it suggests that it suggests that being perceived as an adult contributes to punishment, that's actually not what it shows. And so we still aren't actually clear about the relationship between perceptions of adultification and support for punishment. And so that's something that I'm hoping to test. In political science, established research, as I mentioned before, finds that perceptions of fairness shape attitudes towards punishment. And my expectation is that this perceptions of Black girls as more adult-like will lead the respondents to indicate that Black girls deserve more punishment. So I'm going to try to, demonstrate how this may be playing an important role in the punitive experiences of Black girls' lives. And so this kind of contributes to the following expectations. Black girls are viewed as older than their peers. Black girls are viewed as more dangerous than their peers. Black girls are viewed as more sexual than their peers. And then finally, Black girls are viewed as deserving of more severe forms of punishment than their peers. And here I'm going to specifically look at the idea of suspension being an appropriate punishment. In order to examine these hypotheses, I actually do an original survey experiment. And we did this right before the pandemic officially started in the United States. And so we think that it's reflective of a general period of time. And what the goal was to examine perceptions of punishment. And to do this, we randomly assigned a scenario regarding a dress code violation that varied by race and gender. We used the names Keisha to represent a Black girl, Emily to represent a white girl, Jamal to represent a Black boy, and Jake to represent a white boy. We had approximately 400 participants, and so 100 people in each condition. The names were selected based on those used in previous work. Again, happy to talk about this in Q&A. And the content of the dress code scenario was developed based on qualitative research that demonstrates that punitive experiences of Black girls often begin at the schoolhouse. And so again, referencing Morris's work as well as my own in my book, How Girls Achieve, from last year. So this is a specific scenario that we presented to respondents. The blanks are there because obviously it varied based on what people received, but I'm going to use the word or the name Keisha. Consider an instance where a student named Keisha is wearing shorts to school. When Keisha arrives to class, the teacher tells her that her shorts violate the school's dress code policy. The teacher tells Keisha to leave class and go to the office. This also isn't the first time that Keisha has worn clothes that violate the school's dress code policy. For example, she has previously worn tank tops that are against school rules. Following the presentation of this scenario, we essentially have questions or evaluations of culpability or innocence, which we create by replicating established work in political psychology, but also the really well-cited paper that I referenced earlier by Epstein, Blake, and Gonzalez. And so this leads to us asking the following questions. If the student was acting older than their age, so following the scenario, if the student posed a danger or threat to others, if the student was knowledgeable about sex, and then if the student was provided with appropriate level of punishment for their behavior. And so now I'm going to present the results. But first, I just want to show that the treatment worked. And so here, this is scaled from 0 to 1. What this basically means is that if you multiply the beta or the coefficient by 100, it's essentially the percentage. You can basically read the percentage. We can see here that Keisha and Jamal were known to be the names of Black students, and Emily and Jake were less likely to be considered the names of Black students. And so we feel pretty good that the treatment actually worked. I'm going to be presenting conservative results, meaning that I'm going to just look at those for which the treatment worked, and then present the results based on that group. But it's important to note that if it is the case that we were able to effectively get the treatment to work across all the groups, we would expect these results to be even larger. So we could talk about that more also in the Q&A. And so first, on the question of students acting older than their age, what do we find? We basically see here that both Keisha and Emily are aged up, So we see a gendered effect, not necessarily a racial and gender one, specifically when asked about if the student in the scenario was acting older than their age. And we can see that the differences between Keisha and Emily and, for example, Jake are nearly 20 percentage points. And so that's pretty significant. If we now move to the perception of students being a danger to others, we now start to see the racial and gender impact, as Keisha is perceived as more of a danger to others than the rest of the people who are asked. And we can see that Keisha is seen at about 12 percentage points higher in terms of being a danger to others, and that this is significant at the 0.05 level. If we now move to the question of the student being more knowledgeable about sex, we can essentially see, again, a racial and gender impact, where Keisha is seen as more knowledgeable about sex than other groups, and that the difference between Keisha and Emily is also, again, at the 0.05 level. And finally, when we ask if suspension, so we basically say that the student was suspended, and we ask, is that an appropriate level of punishment? And we see, again, a racial and gender impact, where Keisha is seen to be most appropriately punished through suspension than other people. So essentially, it's too harsh or much harsher for Emily, Jamal, and Jake than it is for Keisha to be suspended for engaging in the same dress code violation. Ultimately, this provides supporting evidence that existing at the intersections of multiple axes of oppression affect public perceptions of Black girls. Figures 2 to 4, which is everything besides the first one around acting older than one's age, are consistent with research on the intersectional nature of the punishment of Black girl students in schools. Both Emily and Keisha are viewed as older, but Keisha is also viewed as relatively more dangerous, experienced with sex, and appropriately punished for violating the dress code, showing the racial and gender impacts. This has important implications, obviously, as it essentially shows that Black girls are experiencing discrimination based on race and gender. And obviously not just that, but that this yields distinct punitive experiences. And from a policy perspective, that matters because it suggests that Black girls are and will likely continue to be punished by policies that fail to realize their intersecting and marginalized identities. So here I present a scenario that essentially looks the same across all these groups, but we see that they have different impacts because race and gender matters, right? What we still don't know is how these punitive experiences may have political consequences for Black women down the line. Here, I'm thinking especially about what lessons might Grace, who I mentioned in the first slide, for example, draw from her current experiences with the justice system, and how might that impact her relationship with government as an adult. This is especially interesting to me when we consider the fact that Black women are superlative political participators. If we look at the period between 1996 and 2012, for example, so the past 20 years, Black women went from participating at 50% to at 70% in 2012. When they participated at 70% in 2012, that was more than any other group in the nation. These rates declined a bit between 2012 and 2016 to 64%, but they were still 10% more likely to, or had 10% higher voting participation rates than the typical American. At the same time, Black women historically and today have been disproportionately punished. Beginning as early as slavery, Black women were denied protection under the law. And so if you consider, for example, colonial sexual abuse laws, which made it such that Black women couldn't allege that they had been sexually abused or trigger word raped, they couldn't be victims, essentially. After emancipation, they remained unprotected on the basis that they were essentially masculinized Black women. So if you see Black women as men, right, then they can't actually say that they are being victims of sexual or gender-based violence. And the interesting piece of this is that although they weren't protected by the law, they were still punished by it. And so Black women were overrepresented in prison during this period, even compared to Black men from 1880s to the early 1900s. In the contemporary period, we see continued evidence of this, right? Between the 1980s and 1990s, the arrest rates for drug offenses by Black women, for example, rose by 828%. And we know, of course, this is compounded by the policing of Black women for issues such as the welfare regulations. And this would, of course, continue to implode through the institution of mandatory minimum sentences and 3-strike laws throughout the 1990s. We've heard a lot of the conversation around the crime bill, right? This is that period. Then in recent years, between 2000 and 2017, things started to look like they were shifting as Black women's arrest rates decreased by 55%, and arrest rates for white women increased by 44%. Nonetheless, the percent of Black women imprisoned remains nearly double that of white women. And so if we look at the fact that they are superlative political participators, but are also increasingly punished, this obviously raises important questions about the impacts of punishment on participation of Black women. And yet we know very little about this topic. Research on the punishment of Black men has found that incarceration lowers the political participation of those with felony convictions and their families and neighbors. If it's the case that the incarceration of Black men and the negative political consequences for their communities is what's to come for Black women who are also disproportionately punished, then we would expect America's most active voting bloc to be in jeopardy. At the same time, I showed you that Black women are experiencing declining arrest rates. And there's this important work in political science that shows that Black women have high levels of social capital and strong social networks. So that may combat the typically negative impacts of punishment on participation. Essentially, there may be like a unicorn effect, right? Black women may not be experiencing punishment at the same level as other groups, or experiencing the negative impacts of punishment as other groups. But I'm actually going to argue that it does, that Black women's punitive experiences negatively impact their voting. So they're not unicorns, they're not distinct from other groups in this regard. But where we do start to see shifts is that Black women more generally are shifting their actions from largely electoral participation, so registration, poll work, voting, to include non-voting participation, such as mutual aid and protests, and that this shift may actually be indicative of a larger kind of disinterest in voting participation. So Black women still believe in the importance of voting. Their experiences with government, including the justice system, though, however, lead them to increasingly focus on informal and local grassroots non-voting participation. Theoretically, I am taking from a theory that I actually coined in my work on school closures and applying it here to think about Black women's shift in participation as perhaps driven by the lack of democratic responsiveness despite their superlative participation. So here, if we just for a moment think about the fact that in 2012, Black women vote at 70%, more than any other group in the nation, but then there's no clear response from the Democratic Party for that participation. They don't receive anything. In, for example, like My Brother's Keeper, which Black men had. And nothing actually happens for Black women until there's a constant fallout and protest about the fact that they didn't get anything for their formal participation. And My Brother's Keeper actually was a result of a target initiative for Black men, right? And so this may contribute over time to what I call their collective participatory debt, or CPD, which is essentially extreme fatigue and disillusionment with the democratic process following repeated participation in it. I won't go into a lot of detail. Coincidentally, this paper was published today in Perspectives on Politics, and so I would encourage people to read it if you're interested in the theory. But what I really want you to take away from this is that what this does is it means that Black women become tired of being these model participants without a democratic response. And so they find other ways to engage in the process, or eventually they may stop engaging altogether. In order to think about testing this theory, I developed the following expectations. First, that Black women's punitive experiences negatively impact their participation. Black women's punitive experiences lead them to participate more in non-electoral forms of political actions. Black women's non-electoral actions are likely related to declining confidence in government due to a lack of democratic responsiveness. I use a plethora of different data and methods. And so you saw the work I presented earlier was an experiment. I'm going to use some existing data from the NES, as well as an original survey that we did, because almost no national surveys include enough Black women in them, and then some early qualitative interviews as well. And so first, I'm going to show you what we're basically seeing around the effects of punitive experiences on Black women. Here in table 1, using the 2016 data, we basically see, as I showed you descriptively, that Black women were more likely to participate in the 2016 election than other groups. But we also see very clearly that punitive experiences, which is a summative measure that includes arrest by the police, stops by the police, as well as experiences of discrimination, is negatively related to voting. And if we look specifically at people's interactions with police, so that's everything except discrimination, that has an even more negative impact on voting. And the original survey that we've conducted, where we asked if they intend to vote, so we don't see clear effects yet, but the NES is going to come out after this election, and then we will know how people actually voted. And we think that'll make a difference for being able to see how those trends look in the 2020 era. But I think these graphs help to kind of hammer the main point, and that is that punitive experiences affect Black women the same way they affect the rest of Americans, meaning that punitive experiences do impact their participation. In 2016, as well as in 2020, while the slopes look a little different, so one represents Black women, essentially the large kind of blue shade that you see shows that there's no distinct differences between Black women and these other populations. Punishment affects them just the same. Black women aren't unicorns. They are impacted by punitive experiences. If we look specifically, though, at non-voting participation, we see a little bit of a different pattern. And so this looks at 2016, and it shows that punitive experiences have the opposite coefficient, which essentially shows that it is positively associated with engaging in non-voting political participation. So this includes mutual aid, this includes protests, this includes just local grassroots civic engagement. And that we see, again, interaction with police further improve or increase the probability of engaging in non-voting political action. And then if we look at 2020, in our original survey, which oversamples Black women, we see a positive impact specifically of Black women having a higher probability of engaging in non-voting actions. And we see here that the punitive experiences and interactions with the police further increase the probability of engaging in non-voting actions. Another way of presenting this is showing that if we look at the blue line and compared to the everyone else, which is the red line, that Black women's who have experienced punishment have a higher, or maybe the highest, probability of engaging in non-voting political actions. So we see this in 2016, and we also see this in 2020. And so we're basically seeing or finding some evidence of the fact that Black women are participating in these more local actions over time. And our survey, when we ask if respondents participated more now compared to 5 years ago, we see evidence of attrition among Black women. So Black women were the least likely to say that their participation increased. And we can see that here. If we dive into those who specifically said that they don't intend to vote or they're still undecided, that was about 22% of the population. And what we can basically see here is that that number represented a higher number than, for example, white men. I also want to note that within the group of people who said that they did not intend to vote, 80% of them had experiences with the justice system, had punitive experiences. 66% of the Black women who didn't intend to vote gave the following reasons for not doing so: that they didn't like the candidates or the campaign issues, they weren't interested in politics, or they didn't think their vote will make a difference. But here's the piece that I think is especially interesting and that I'll talk about for the rest of this talk. Even among those who were fatigued with the democratic process, so 61% of these Black women who were fatigued with the democratic process still participated in local mutual aid, support for local and female-owned minority businesses, and other kinds of community work. And so we suggest that while this fatigue is real and is perhaps impacting Black women's participation, Black women are still voting and actually participating in local actions as well. And so we thought, well, let's look at this trend over time. And so first, I'm going to show to the left, this is just voting data from the NES between 2000 and 2016. And Black women are represented by the dark red line. And what we basically see, consistent with what I showed you all descriptively earlier, is that, you know, between 2000 and 2012, we see this increase. And then we see this slight dip between 2012 and 2016. It's still higher than everyone else, but there is a little bit of a trend downward, whereas white female, for example, looks more flat. If we look at participation during this same period in local actions, we can see that between 2012 and 2016, that dark red line shoots up. And so while voting participation has a slight decline, participation in local actions has a steep incline, right? So we see this as a potential descriptive evidence of the fact that Black women are shifting their participation. We think this is explained by just declining confidence that the federal government is going to respond to their needs. So Black women's confidence in government has been wavering. Between 2008 and 2010, so right after Obama was elected, it shot up and it was higher than every other group. But we can see how this has consistently declined since, to the point where now it's the lowest of every other group. And so we think confidence may be playing an important role in why we see these shifts. When people aren't responded to by government, that this directly probably impacts the way that they think about their participation with government. In our early qualitative interviews, we see some evidence that this might be what's happening. And it may be indicative of this theory of what I describe as collective participatory debt. And so these are interviews I conducted with justice involved women in Chicago who varied in terms of their experiences with the justice system. And we got responses when asking them about voting, such as the following: "It's crazy, but you want me to vote for you for what? And the only time we see you is when you want to vote, is when you want our vote. Other than that, I don't even know who you are, what you do, or anything. You want me to continue to vote for you, and you got my neighborhood looking like a rat hole." We saw further evidence of indicative of a disillusionment with the idea of participating but not getting anything in response. For example, this person who said, "I haven't decided about that," referring to voting. They're not coming to do nothing in these communities. And then finally, this last quote, which I will read in full, which I think captures this idea really well, of the fact that people are participating but not getting anything in response. This person said the following: "We're not being treated equally. The Constitution, I don't even feel it applies to me. It doesn't feel like I'm being treated like a citizen. So why should I act like one? I'm doing everything I need to do, but I'm still being treated like a criminal." CPD is about engaging in citizenship and democracy repeatedly, not getting a democratic response, and kind of being fatigued by it. And we see potentially evidence of that. Now, it's important to note that it's not that these women have been persistently disillusioned or persistently negative, and that's why the shift piece is so important to this project. when we talk about Obama, we see a very different story. Everyone described voting for him. So I voted when it was Obama. Another person said I voted for Obama, right? This was a very common aspect of the interviews, and we expect it to continue to be common in the interviews that we have thereafter. Yet it's important to note that there's still an element of not being overwhelmed by the Obama era either. And so when you think about not being overwhelmed by the Obama era, and then moving into the Trump era, we can see how this confidence might have continued to decline, starting with Obama and then plummeting, right, under Trump. And so, for example, this person responded, before Trump, I felt like things were mediocre. Once Trump got into office, it felt like an episode of SNL or The Simpsons. When Obama was president, it was cool, it was decent. So here we see, again, not an over-enthusiasm around the Obama election per se, but essentially noticing that there's a difference between the two, although they're not at all necessarily exalted by either one. I think what's especially interesting is the fact that they acknowledge that even though they don't see voting as necessarily impacting their community, that is still important. As this one person said, who had been in prison for 20 plus years, with voting, I know that it's going to have a big impact on the world, but I don't know if it's going to have a big impact on my life. But with the fair tax, I believe in voting in that. I plan on supporting the fair tax, so I'm going to vote. It's important to note in Illinois that the fair tax is a policy that basically says that if you earn over $400,000, you will be taxed at a higher rate. And so this is a local based policy. And we can see here how people may still vote because they know that it's important, but they're able to distinguish that even when they do vote, that is probably not actually going to impact them, and that they have to engage in actions that will impact them, such as supporting the fair tax. Across the board, without prompt, we saw people reference programs that they think did impact them and that were more local, even as they may have expressed uncertainty about voting impacting them in the same way. And so the census came up often. For example, this quote where a person says, I did the census in April because more programs, we need more programs for our teens and for us. I'm going to vote yes for the fair tax thing, but I'm not really into the political part. And then finally, a person who said, I do the census because if I don't, I'm taking away something that I might need or something that someone in my community might need. And so I showed you earlier the shift of looking at the current election and seeing voting as not impacting the potholes in their communities, and how it represents a shift from the Obama period when they were excited to vote, even though they may not have been particularly pleased by the outcome. And then seeing people say, I see voting as important to the broader community, but for me, I need to do the census, right? For me, I need to support the fair tax. That's what's going to help me. Ultimately, Black women are voting at some of the highest rates in the nation, even as they recognize that voting may not directly impact their lives. I show you that they still are voting largely. Increasingly, though, I'm hoping to also demonstrate that Black women are also participating in non-voting actions more than any other group. So they're voting more than any other group, and they're participating in civic local actions more than any other group. This may be related to declining confidence in the federal government, combined with their disproportionate punitive experiences. And so the shift may actually represent a new pattern in Black women's voting. And so the result is that they're taking on additional civic burdens, which may eventually lead to CPD, so their overall fatigue and disillusionment with the democratic process. Because if they're not responded to by government, then they may actually continue to transition their actions to more local actions, thus participating less in the formal democratic processes. I want to make clear that this project really is demonstrating that ultimately the health and well-being of our democracy is deeply tied to Black women and girls. While many Black women will continue to do it all, voting, organizing, mutual aid, community service, women who have experiences with the justice system are already burdened with the additional challenge of surviving in a nation bent on making their past their prologue, and with an unresponsive government, even when they do participate. In this environment, we should expect that the superlative participation of Black women thus far to be less certain in the future, unless something significantly changes in the way that they are treated by government. So when you have, and this starts with the fact that Black girls who as early as 6 years old are more likely to be arrested and detained than, for example, the cops who killed Breonna Taylor in her sleep. We know that those experiences, as well as Black girls being the fastest growing juvenile justice population, ultimately negatively impacts voting down the line. And so changing this trajectory, and thus its impact on democracy, really does start with dismantling the punitive experiences of Black girls. And so I will stop there, and I look forward to question and discussion. Thanks.
So I hope you all will join me in a rousing virtual applause for Dr. Nuamah, whose work is just so path-breaking and relevant to this very moment. I think perhaps the most efficient way to handle the Q&A is just for folks to indicate they have a question in the chat, and then perhaps from there, would you like support with calling on people, Dr. Nuamah, or?
Great. Also, should I still be sharing, or okay, looks like they stopped it. Bam. Okay. But yeah, that would be great if possible.
Sure. So I see that Ed Rockenbrow has a question.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. And it's so timely for you to be in Philly today, this week of all weeks. My question is about disaggregating your data on Black girls and women. Because a lot of what you presented, a lot of what I saw at least, I have to apologize because I did have to leave for a second to move my car. But a lot of what I saw you present presented Black girls and women as kind of a monolithic group. And I'm wondering, in what ways might your work be able to disaggregate around age, geographic region, sexuality, income, and to what extent do you think that's actually important for your work? Or does your work actually, is it important for you to actually present this broader view of Black girls and women without disaggregating? Hopefully that question is clear.
That is clear. I think it's really clear, especially because my previous work with How Girls Achieve was really about looking at, income and sexuality and Black girls who are kind of the most marginalized within the Black girl group. This work, I feel like, is a little bit more fundamental. Like, as a political scientist, I was just shocked at the fact that we didn't know or hadn't studied the fact, the relationship between the punitive experiences that Black women broadly were having and its potential political consequences. And so I almost felt like I had to do basic science research. Like, I needed to just show that these disparities were existing and that they mattered. And I think that the future version of this work, will certainly benefit from taking on these class as well as sexuality dimensions, because one thing is that originally when Black feminist scholarship was sort of conceptualized, so many Black women were poor. And so class just wasn't, when we talked about Black women, we were talking about poor Black women. That isn't necessarily the case anymore. And when I talk about justice involved Black women, a lot of times I am talking about poor Black women. But it could be the case that the women who are voting are women who don't fit that economic category, right? And so I haven't seen that in my data thus far in terms of statistically, but I do know that there's going to be things that show up and that are going to be important to pay attention to. And thank you for that comment, because it's something that I'm on it.
And I'm really, just real quick, I'm really interested in age in particular, just to think about how generation shapes the attitudes towards voting. So I look forward to that. Fabulous presentation.
But I think in thinking about my interviews with Black girls as compared to my adult Black women, I expect a lot of that to come out. So thanks for that.
Wonderful. So we have a question that was typed in the comments or in the chat window. And so I'm wondering if Sabila, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, if you would like to directly ask your question.
Yes, sure. Thank you. It's Sibylla. You said it very well. Thanks. Thank you for such a moving and upsetting presentation. A lot of things were going through my mind, but I guess to boil it down to something that might be for the future is what comes after the fatigue. This is something that really scares me. I know it's a stopping point in the circle of moving things, and I can sense it. I live in West Philly. I work with the community. And actually, Ed's point to age, is that something that maybe the come after the fatigue? Thank you.
Yeah, what happens after the fatigue? Good question. So, I was telling, Dean Grossman earlier that like, when I present this work, I feel kind of like bad because it's a little pessimistic. But I think it's, accurate in that how much can you expect people to participate and be model citizens? Like even in my closures work, I find that those impacted by closures participate the most in community meetings, vote the most, participate the highest rate to try to to get an elected school board. And they ultimately still don't achieve those outcomes that democracy claims is necessary when you participate. And so I actually think that the best way to change that is for democracy to participate. Democracy to respond to these groups. But to your point, I also see that people are always looking for reasons to believe in democracy again. People want to believe again. And I think that if, whether it's through and that's perhaps why they participate in grassroots organizing. Maybe that's why they go and do mutual aid, because they're looking for ways to be restored so they can go and fight the next battle. And so I think in terms of generational issues, younger people who are growing up currently, I think at this particular moment, I'm not seeing necessarily more enthusiasm towards the democratic system. And I think that people who've done this for a long time have a sort of freedom as a constant struggle approach. And I think that, but I do think that with time, those younger groups will also find ways to try to believe again, because that's part of survival.
Wonderful. So we have a question from John Zimmerman.
Thought-provoking, and because I'm a historian, I listen to it historically. And I'm sure you're familiar, there's a growing body of research about young African-American women during the civil rights era. I'm thinking especially of work by Rachel Devlin. And these are people growing up in situations that are, if anything, more hostile to democracy and more organized to degrade them than anything today. Yet at the same time, one of the things that I think that work shows is, despite those forms of ritual and practical degradation, that the experience of the civil rights movement, if anything, for these young African-American women, reinforced their faith in democracy and the need to improve it. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the contrast here, because to me, it's extremely sharp. And I'm wondering how you would explain it.
Just for a little bit of clarity. So these young women who participated in, the civil rights era become more inclined to participate afterwards, or they believe more in the democratic sort of pathway?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when Ada Sapul gets off the plane in Oklahoma and they say, "What did you learn?" She said, "The first thing I learned is we got to believe in the Constitution." Yeah.
And so the fallout of that period is what we're experiencing. So I think that people saw, this is the first time they have the voting rights, right? This is the first time you see an emerging, not the first time if you think about Reconstruction, but you see an emerging middle class. You see, you see the result of that work through a policy lens. And so if you think about classic political science literature, from protest to politics, that's actually part of the shift, is that people move from thinking that they actually can make a difference in the policy sphere. That is one of the biggest takeaways of that era, is that policy might make a difference. And that's why you see John Lewis and others, Jesse Jackson, going into policy. I think we're on the other end of that spectrum, where people are feeling like policy may not be doing the work that they thought it could do. They're seeing the limits of policy. They're seeing the limits of federal government. And it's important to note that these Black women are still voting, but they're also saying that it's for other people. They're voting for those who can't vote. They're voting for those, other communities, but for themselves, they have to engage in mutual aid. In order for them to survive, they have to do these other things. And so I actually think it's a great way of explaining this particular moment.
Wonderful. And your response and this previous question actually sets up the question I was hoping to ask you, which is so much of what we see in political science in particular really defines or centers electoral participation as how we are measuring civic engagement. And one of the things I was really excited by in your presentation is the fact that you do not do that, right? When you talk about Black women who are engaged in justice work, or various ways that they are thinking and acting civically, you seem to have a much broader definition of what civic and political participation looks like. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, and also talk a little bit more about, similar to what you were just doing, about for Black women who are decades removed from some of the promise and potential that, elders imagined during the civil rights era, what that means for them.
Yeah, that's, I could say so much about this particular area. So I'm, just work with me as I think about it. So first thing that comes to my mind is that the focus on non-electoral participation really was driven by my work on school closures, which is, I didn't always present it this way, but it's also a largely gendered issue in terms of the people who were at these meetings and were speaking at them were largely women who would talk about the closings of their schools, like life or death. And they would talk about, I blame Barack Obama for this. And so I saw people making connections between, federal government and their lives in these kind of negative ways. And then realizing that Obama wasn't going to save them and, trying to think about how they could save themselves by engaging with local civic action and local community and trying to change policy at the local level. Now, I think it's also policy itself and the idea of using the political system to make change has become gendered, right? And that who gets the opportunity to run for office, who gets funding, who gets perceived as a representative for Black people, it becomes Black men. And so as Black women continue to be obscure, and removed from this political process that's supposed to promise them all of what democracy comes with, they have no choice but to figure out other mechanisms by which they can engage in the democratic process. And I think political science then invisibilizes this group because they're focusing on this formal electoral participation. And so they're like, we don't see Black women here, and it's like, yes, because the process itself has invisibilized them. And if we study political participation in this narrow sense, we invisibilize them too, right? Ultimately, I think Black women are running for office at higher rates. Things are shifting. People are starting to talk about punishment more and how it's affecting Black women. But I think it's still, until we see a shift in terms of democratic responsiveness, until we see people talking about Black Lives Matter in a way that centers Black women, until we see those kinds of people who are trying to decolonize the curriculum by doing anti-racist work, but aren't also thinking about anti-sexist work, until we see those things as part and parcel of each other, then I think we should expect Black women to continue to respond in ways that are compatible with their survival.
Thanks for that response. So we do still have a few minutes for additional questions or comments. And so I just want to remind people of that and to invite additional questions or comments, including, I see John has also responded in the chat. I don't know if you would like to follow up. You're muted.
I take Sally's point very seriously about kind of differential opportunities and levels of political participation based on gender. But I also think that that highlights a really important contrast to the past, which we're starting to learn about, which is that if you think about school desegregation, actually the pioneers were overwhelmingly female, not male, which I think again highlights an important contrast here.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think that that's a really, there are often, women who've been involved in these processes throughout history, right? But yeah, over time, if those women aren't responded to or incorporated, then I think you have the kind of things that I'm describing.
Wonderful. I see that Abby has a hand raised, so please feel free to chime in.
Hi, thank you. It's Abby. Thank you. Dr. Nuamah, thank you so much. I have to say, before I checked my calendar today of what I was doing, I excitedly downloaded your article. So I'm really excited to read that. I know yeah. So I'm so excited by your work. I'm a grad student. I study political science and education policy. So yeah, to say that I'm a fan of your stuff is an understatement. But I just want to ask, I feel like this is sort of maybe more of a boring question because substantively, what you're doing is huge. I do study participation, in particular looking at young people. And one thing that I have come across is really sort of is in trying to intervene and saying that participation is more than just voting, is operationalizing how, right? So really just like using, like, what are we measuring, in addition to ANES, what are we using to say in our statistical work that folks are engaging? Because that is sort of one of the main tools of the trade right now, is doing that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and sort of what you've done with that.
Absolutely. So one thing that's hard about all of this work that I care about is the lack of existing data. And then when you're a graduate student and you're poor, like it's even more difficult. So I'm glad you asked that question. So in the original survey, we did ask a series of questions around like what they do engage with. And we left it open to say, like, did we miss anything? Did we leave anything? So we said, do you engage in mutual aid? Do you support Black-owned businesses? Do you, so that was kind of a way to get like statistically a summation of the kinds of activities that people engage in. And my school closures work, when I was a graduate student, I didn't have money. We tried to like look at, for example, I benefited from using community meeting transcripts, and then putting those in vivo and looking at how people not only responded within that period, but also how they described other forms of participation from those meeting minutes. We looked at local school board elections, but also basic other things like how many people signed a petition or a ballot to get an elected school board. And that was a way of saying like, okay, if these communities got more people, got more signatures in another one, that's a political action, right? And so you have to be really creative in terms of being like, what are people doing? And people are going to community meetings, people are signing petitions, people are going door to door, and then trying to say, okay, if people are going to door to door, how can I collect that? How can I actually engage with, take data from those areas and make it make sense with the independent variable that I care about. And so for me, in that case, it was school closures. And I was like, if your school is closed, like, how does that impact the number of signatures you have on that ballot to get an elected school board, right? Or how many people show up at a community meeting? And so that was sort of a way that I tried to take advantage of those more local forms of participation. But from a survey, I just asked people like, a wide breadth of things that they may be engaged with, and then created a summative variable for that. So happy to talk more about that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So my understanding is that we have about 10 more minutes. This goes until 1:15, and we have 2 more hands that I see. So I think we should have time to take both of them. So let's start with Danielle.
Okay. Hi. Sorry. First, thank you so much. I think this was amazing, and also like very relevant for me because I'm a senior at Penn studying political science, and my thesis focuses on like hyper-punitive practices imposed upon Black girls in Philadelphia public schools. And something that I feel like I'm struggling with is how to present that like issue, which I'm taking like an intersectionality studies lens. How do you present that as like something that's political science related? And I know that it's not the same as looking at like Black women and how that translates to like participating in like democracy, but I'm trying to emphasize that just the standalone looking at hyperpunitive practices of Black women, like that is a political science issue. But I don't know like how, like I would be interested to ask you in terms of Black girls specifically, how do you see that as like something that relates back to the field?
That is the story of my life. So that will not stop. And so the way that I conceive of this is that people learn about government and democracy and citizenship through the institutions that they interact with the most. For most Americans, that is school. If at school, their first experiences with the state and authority is punitive, that does and should have consequences on the way that they engage with and think about their citizenship relative to others later on. And so that's kind of the way that I've, taken your question and thought about it for myself for a long time. This work is more directly like political science, but before I could even get there, I had to do what you're describing. It's really just look at the schoolhouse and what's happening there with Black girls and say like, this is actually impacting their ability to access what democracy promises. And so it's inherently a political question. And so what you're doing is definitely political work. And I hope that, the framing that I presented helps you think about this in the future. And I'm also always happy to talk more about that. But do you, and we'll figure out how to make it political science later.
Thank you.
That's wonderful advice and something for us all to live by. So I'd love for us to take our last question from Ayana.
Hi. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. It was really great to, just hear everything that you had to say. My name is actually Stanley. I am a visiting PhD student from Georgia Tech studying human-centered computing. I'm actually collaborating with Ayana on some projects, and I was kind of just in the background listening to this talk, and I was like, oh my God, like this is amazing. I don't get to benefit from these sorts of conversations at a Georgia Tech when you consider the climate of things going on in Atlanta. And, yesterday I watched the movie The Hate You Give. I'm not sure if everyone has seen it, but if you haven't, I highly, did it go?
Are we still?
Oh, hi. Yeah, everybody watch. But basically a piece in that movie that stuck out to me is when the young white female in her retort to Star's comment, she basically said, you can't always use the race card. And I feel like if we acknowledge that racism exists, and then, white people use the race card as a retort to discuss or to kind of devalidate racism when it is completely valid and how it could be applied to that particular situation. And it's like the race card is kind of like throwing away a completely legitimate cause of why something is happening. And I really just wanted to know your take on when people use the race card, what the race card actually means and why it shouldn't even exist.
Yeah, I think you answered it. It shouldn't exist. Racism is real. And, you know, it's always been a consistent and central theme of American democracy. And so I do think what you're getting at is, you know, beyond just even this presentation, I think it has to do with our daily interactions with colleagues and, you know, life, and the idea of like not being able to use race. So, or talk about race, or to have to act raceless in our everyday interactions. And I think you're really getting at something that's expressing that, you know, that the notion or the idea that we can't bring to these spaces our race is something that is, you know, problematic. And I think a lot of the racial uprisings and recent events are, I think, a response of people being kind of tired of not being able to center racial issues when they're at the center of American democracy and, of course, our lives, if you know, especially if you're a Black person, but even if you're not, because they shape the way this democracy has, you know, unfolded. So yeah, I think you really answered the question. I think that even the idea of the fact that rhetorically we can say that the race card is something that, you know, people shouldn't pull is, you know, a problem. And it really is, I think, symbolic in general of the difficulty of showing up as ourselves in a lot of spaces that we're in, or even the idea that we can't talk about race in certain situations when it's a part of our everyday life. And so, yeah, thank you for that comment. I think, you know, I'm sure other people appreciated you raising that, that sentiment.
And thank you for the wonderful presentation. I really appreciate it.
So on that note, I'm just scanning the chat and I don't think we have any further questions. So I hope you all will join me in thanking Dr. Nuamah for a truly wonderful presentation and a really generous question and answer period. And I hope you will read the article that just came out today. And also How Girls Achieve, which again is just a wonderful book, and all of Dr. Nuamah's wonderful work. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all so much. I really enjoy being back. And thanks, Crystal, for the awesome introduction. And, you know, if anyone has any comments or other thoughts, please feel free to send me a note.
Oh, are you on any social media that people can follow and continue to engage with your work?
Yeah, sure. So you can follow me on Twitter. And it's just my first name dash my last name. So if you just look up my name on Twitter, I'll be there. So and the paper is also, you know, I tweeted it today. So you can follow me and learn more about that as well.
Wonderful. So thank you all for joining us today, and be well.